Coming in number 5, we've got Union Cemetery. Well, it was bound to happen. A haunted cemetery. Who would have guessed? That's the thing, too. I feel like so many horror movies over the years just straight up avoid cemeteries. It's always the demons in the house, ghosts in the hotel, apparitions down by the river. You would think it would be a no-brainer to situate a spooky movie in a place populated by mostly people past due, but hey. So this story is quite an interesting one and features the classic woman in white ghost. Known as one of the most haunted cemeteries in America, Union Cemetery sits in Easton, Connecticut. Damn, Connecticut, you really are haunted. So even before the Warrens arrived on the scene, this place had a reputation for the paranormal. All sorts of folks claim to have seen the cemetery's most famous ghost, the White Lady of Easton. Out of context, that might sound scary in a whole other way, but for now, we focus on ghostly details. Her signature trick is to jump in front of moving vehicles near the cemetery, startling drivers and often causing them to veer off the road. When Ed and Lorraine came to visit, they claimed to have seen the White Lady themselves, although not for very long. Ed saw a collection of ghost lights come together to form the shape of a woman, one with dark hair, a white dress, and possibly most startling of all, no facial features. He didn't get a chance to really soak it in though, as when he stepped towards her, she disappeared. A movie that investigated the origins and motivations of just such a ghost would be quite interesting, especially with some real spooky car scenes. What's more is that there's another spirit that seems to haunt Union Cemetery. Visitors have reported seeing glowing red eyes watching them from the bushes as they made their way through. This entity has been aptly named Red Eyes and could add some extra scares and texture to the overall story. Plenty of potential in this tale. Coming in at number 4, we've got Poor Frenchie. That's a blast from the past, eh? It's been a while since I've heard of anyone being referred to as Frenchie, but here we are. It's such an old-fashioned nickname, don't you think? Interestingly enough, we've actually seen a bit of Frenchie before in the Conjuring series. He makes a quick appearance in both the original movie, when Ed and Lorraine explain the stages of possession, and again in The Nun. But we want more of the man known as Maurice Thoreau. Kicking this adaptation off easy, there's already a book about this particular case. Known as Satan's Harvest, it draws from a few different accounts of what happened. We get perspective from the Boston Herald reporters who were first on the scene, some accounts from folks close to Frenchie, and of course, the Warrens' take on the matter. It's a tale of a Massachusetts farmer who seemed to have two personalities living inside of him. On one side, he was the hard-working, friendly, and all-around amicable guy that many aspire to be. But he had a much darker personality hiding within, one that was terribly abusive towards his children and that he had little to no control over. He first went to the police for help, but they couldn't do much. Then he saw his priest, who wasn't prepared to deal with whatever demons were inside of him. So finally, he contacted Ed and Lorraine, who came through and witnessed the unspeakable. Frenchie was contorting into inhuman shapes, bleeding from the eyes, and covered in raised welts, taking the shapes of crosses and profane phrases in French. At that point, they knew they'd have to bring in an expert exorcist, Bishop Robert McKenna. I think that a movie specifically looking at Frenchie's struggles would be fascinating, especially if the arrival of the Warrens happened later. Like, wouldn't it be interesting to watch as this upstanding, community-driven man realizes there's something dark within him? He's not sure if it's a devil or his own mind, and his family is starting to catch on. He wants to get help, but doesn't know where. A slow descent into madness has been done before, but with a few historical nods and a couple Conjuring tie-ins, this could make for some excellent viewing. Coming at number 3, we've got the Snedekers. First of all, great name. Snedeker. It's just fun to say. I wonder if that had anything to do with the demons causing untold amounts of pain and misfortune in this family's life. Like, these evil entities were all like, hey, it's the Snedekers. Sounds fun, right? Let's go mess with them. There's a good chance you're already familiar with this particular case. It's extra gruesome with a nice dollop of morbidity for good measure. If you've seen The Haunting in Connecticut, you know the Snedekers. But like most movies made in the early 2000s, there was a bit left to be desired. I'd love to see this flick reimagined with all sorts of additional details, maybe even some flashbacks to the original crimes, because there's a lot going on here. The Snedekers moved to a seemingly normal home in order to be closer to the hospital their son was being treated at. It was a fixer-upper for sure, but the price was right and the location was exactly what they needed. However, the realtors seemed to neglect to tell them that it was once a funeral parlor. And worse yet, the dude who ran it wasn't the most moral of folks. He had been known to do things to the bodies left in his care, and there was talk of other assorted rituals being completed here. So when the Snedekers settled in, they started experiencing unexplainable events. It kicked off with classic poltergeist activity and escalated to full-on assaults. It's a pretty famous story at this point and would work well within the framework already set up. A lot of paranormal enthusiasts were disappointed in the changes made to complete The Haunting in Connecticut, so this is a golden opportunity to rework the story to match the original tale more closely. Coming in at number 2, we've got Borley Church. And you might be thinking, hey, they've done this before. And you know what? You're technically right. This is the church that a lot of the stuff that happened in The Nun was based on. But folks love Valak and could use a lot more of this terrifying church-going demon and its contemporaries. The Nun took place, chronologically anyway, way before the Warrens got started with their demonology practice. So what if we got a movie of them returning to this church in their own time? They did travel to England to get a closer look at this haunted spot and even seemed to find out some stuff about the ghosts that lived there. There's a legend of a nun and a monk who carried out an affair and paid the ultimate price. Learning about this steamy romance and then having the Warrens arrive to puzzle out what the haunting was all about could make for some great silver screen action. Find a way to bring in the demon once more and add some other crossover events and you've got a spooky summer blockbuster that'll have fans looking at their local places of worship a little differently. And finally at number 1 we've got Amityville. And one more that folks will definitely be well acquainted with. Of course we've all heard of the Amityville Horror. There's a lot of history in that home, from the atrocity Ronald DeFeo Jr. committed to the ever-controversial claims from the Lutz family. I'm not really sure what would make for the most compelling movie, though. I think the true crime crowd would definitely be interested in the inner machinations of a man who decided to kill his entire family in the night. Possibly even more interesting, why would the Lutz family decide that a year after said unfortunate event was the right time to move in? The purported haunting itself and the involvement of the Warrens might play second fiddle, if we're being honest. The paranormal aspects have been investigated plenty, so what if we took the skeptical angle and delved into the psyches of those who lived in the house rather than the demons they claim to see? Now that could raise some eyebrows and turn some heads. Personally, I'm very excited to see these ideas in action. However, if they do end up hitting the big screen without a little financial compensation to yours truly, well, they'll be hell to pay. So, what'd you think of the list? Number 5, we've got the Smurl haunting. Technically, there already is a movie about the Smurl haunting, titled The Haunted, and released as a made-for-TV movie back in 1991, folks with cable television were treated to a horrifying vision of demonic possession in Pennsylvania. However, we live in the golden age of streaming, with brand new top-notch movies and shows being released almost daily. So with the advances in filmmaking technology and maybe some assistance from the research team at Blumhouse, I think this tale could be brought back to life in incredible fashion. Based on what's happened with the mainline Conjuring series lately, it would be interesting to see a return to a strictly haunted house format, but the story here is rich enough to make it work. Here's the real-life story of the Smurls. Hopefully you'll see how it works as a movie. In the mid-70s, Janet and Jack Smurl were forced out of their home due to flood damage. They packed up their stuff, got their kids and parents in a car, and moved down to West Pittston. For a while, they focused their energy on fixing the place up. Some painting needed to be done and old appliances need to be replaced. Other than that though, all seemed well. This was short-lived, however. Soon, weird things started happening. Tools would disappear without a trace or end up in places far away from where they should be. Stains would seep through brand new coats of paint no matter how thick it was laid on. Kitchen appliances would catch fire even if they weren't plugged in at the time. And of course, terrible smells permeated throughout but would disappear quickly once noticed. Pretty standard haunted stuff if you ask me. But that was just the beginning, as even more noticeable ghastly behavior began. The kids heard disembodied voices that pretended to be their siblings, and Janet insisted that she heard her mother-in-law calling out to her. Dark shapes would float around the house, and one night, one seemed to crawl into bed with the Smurls. Needless to say, they were pretty freaked out. Things hit a fever pitch when the family dog was thrown up against the wall, and Janet was picked up and dangled 3 feet in the air. At that point, it was time to bring in some help. The Warrens arrived and soon found out that there were 3 human spirits in the house, accompanied by a malevolent demon. 2 of the spirits were harmless and the 3rd one was potentially violent, but the demon was the real problem. It made the other spirits do awful things and intensified the haunting plenty. You can see how this would make for an excellent horror movie, right? We meet the Smurls as they're moving in. Things are hunky-dory. However, the kids notice some strange stuff at night and mom and dad are wondering why their renovations aren't holding up. Then something changes and it is full-on haunt mode. Ed and Lorraine show up and the mystery begins to unravel. Tie it in with the other Conjuring flicks and you've got yourself a summer horror blockbuster. Blumhouse, call me. Coming in at number 4, we've got Lindley Street. Here we have another famous haunted house which would perfectly align with the rest of the series had they not switched it up for The Devil Made Me Do It. I'm sure a return to form would go over just fine though. Moving on from my goofy format-based nitpicking, here's a good story. Haunted houses tend to get folks interested in anything, so that's a good start. Also happening in the mid-70s at the time, this was a well-publicized poltergeist. Connecticut is famous for all sorts of haunted and damned locations, but Lindley Street is probably one of the most famous. Gerard and Laura Goodwin, homeowners and Good Samaritans, reported an array of otherworldly attacks in their little bungalow. Windows were broken, furniture was scattered, a cat inexplicably spoke in English, and more. The longer this went on, the more folks became interested. For a while, all sorts of folks that weren't the Goodwins saw these paranormal occurrences too. That's what made this such a high-profile haunting. All sorts of reputable and reliable community members claiming to see insane, seemingly impossible things happening in their peaceful neighborhood. News teams, nosy neighbors, firefighters, police squads, priests, and of course the Warrens were called in to see what they could do. And then, just like the neighbors, the policemen and firefighters saw the paranormal experiences happening. So there are a few ways we could approach this tale of terror in a cinematic fashion. There's the obvious way, which is fitting the events into the Conjuring universe and having all sorts of new characters introduced that could have witnessed the haunting. Classic, can't miss stuff right there. However, the guy in me who took a bunch of film courses at university makes me want to look at this a little differently. You know, I want to hear all sorts of different perspectives, a bit of he said, she said, maybe investigate what each individual saw and see if there is an ultimate answer. If I'm being too vague, I'll come right out and say it. Let's make a haunted house Rashomon. Like, have the Warrens or some surrogate demonologists come in at the very beginning and ask folks what's happening. Then you get accounts from each invested party and every tale is different in some way or another. And then, as is the case with most real-life haunted houses, we don't really come away with a concrete answer. Just the tales of those who experienced it themselves and the tricky job of putting the pieces together ourselves. Think about it. Coming in at number 3, we've got the Donovan family. Ghosts and romance. Ain't nothing better, right? Plus, when was the last time they made a specter-filled love story for the big screen? We got Warm Bodies a while ago, but since then we've really seen nothing new. Maybe a few indie movies where the monsters are surprisingly alluring, and I suppose The Shape of Water counts for something, but all of those have physical monsters to smush. Lust is a hell of a drug, don't you know? So what if we took the story of a girl summoning a ghost via Ouija board and then falling in love with it? Well, that's what happened with the Donovan family haunting. Their daughter brought a demon into the house, dated it for a bit, and then realized that it was just using her to sap at the life force of everyone around. Yikes. You've heard of people being used for their bodies or their money, but their life energy? That's gotta sting a little bit. It would be a fun descent into madness, with audiences realizing halfway through that this otherworldly suitor does not have the protagonist's best interests at heart. Definitely worth a rewatch to see what you missed the first time too. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Southend werewolf. Now, we've talked about returning to haunted houses a couple times today with varying results, but what about adding a werewolf story to the Conjuring universe? And that's what I'm talking about. The Warrens apparently had a run-in with some sort of lichen adjacent during one of their exorcisms. It wasn't a traditional werewolf. Full moons and silver bullets were more or less left out of the equation. But in the case of Bill Ramsey, a hellish transformation apparently did take place. As a kid, Ramsey had a few bestial outbursts, but seemed to chill out as he got a little older. However, out of the blue, an adult Ramsey started acting absolutely feral once more. After a brief stint in a mental hospital, Ramsey linked up with the Warrens and made his way to the States, where a priest was waiting to perform an exorcism. During this ritual, witnesses claimed to have seen him turn partially into some sort of man-beast. Now, I'd say if you're gonna make a movie about this, you're gonna need to have a full transformation a couple times, you know, to get that American Werewolf in London vibe. Hell, even the backstory should be him actually contorting into a fanged beast and running rampant. It won't be all true, but it will make for some excellent popcorn moments. And finally, at number 1, we've got West Point. Unsurprisingly, there are a lot of haunted military academies out there. One of the most famous, and therefore most movie-worthy, is the West Point Academy in New York. For years, cadets, recruits, superintendents, librarians, and more reported weird goings-on. Ghost soldiers would appear before frightened students, and items frequently got tossed around. All sorts of colorful, undead characters tend to show up here as well. There's the Pusher, a chilling apparition that pushes and holds people down in their sleep, rendering them immobile. Then there's the ghost cook Molly, who is a little disgruntled and likes to rumple bed sheets and smash wine bottles. One of the most famous ghosts here is a soldier turned murderer known as Greer. The Warrens were called in during the 70s to see what they could do about it all and spoke with and did impressions of some of these figures. Any or all of these ghosts would make for a really fun flick filled with poltergeist style scares and ghosts with real personality. Now, I'm sure that in due time we'll see all these stories adapted. The Conjuring universe is an insane moneymaker, and the Warren stories are too good to pass up.
Number 5. The Trial of Cheyenne Johnson. Also known as the Devil Made Me Do It case, this is the first recorded court case in United States history that used demonic possession as basis for a defendant's claim that had ultimately resulted in the first-degree manslaughter of Connecticut man Alan Bono. It began with the Glatzel family after their 11-year-old son David had allegedly been possessed by a demonic beast who assaulted him in an attic. This manifested itself as David began to experience night terrors, exhibit strange behaviour and fall victim to unexplained wounds, scratches and bruises. Of course, after calling upon the services of a Catholic priest and finding no resolution, the family contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. Soon after, Lorraine witnessed a black mist around David, an apparent indication of demonic involvement, as well as red hand marks around his neck, a demon choking him. The Warrens attempted to perform 3 exorcisms on the boy, where during one attempt the demon spoke out and said that David's stepfather, Arn Johnson, would commit a murder when the demonic host would go on to possess him itself. Well, that's exactly what happened, strangely enough, and Arn Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He still maintains that he was possessed by a demon to this day, despite the court not believing so. Coming in at Warren's psychic photography. Although admittedly not a single case but an exhibition of quite a large number, a technique that was woven by the Warrens throughout their career as paranormal investigators. Now take this with a pinch of salt, because for those that oppose the Warrens' claims, the majority of criticism comes from their specific technique of paranormal photography. The vast majority of the Warrens' physical evidence comes from photography, racking up hundreds of ghost snaps that form the basis of their alleged paranormal evidence, which must fit 2 specific instructions for it to make the grade. Use an autofocused or fixed focus camera with an automatic flash, and the more power the flash, the better. Supposedly, the more exposition of light, the more successful it will be to catch ghosts, specifically under Lorraine's technique, which pinpoints energy vortices and allows a spirit to manifest itself. They used this technique for the entirety of their career and it never seemed to change, but for me it is probably the weakest part of their casework and has the most holes when it comes to credibility. What do you guys think? Swinging in at our...
Finally, coming in at number 1, we've got Enfield poltergeist. Taking the Warrens across the ocean, the Enfield poltergeist has become a popular paranormal case, with it also being the focal point for The Conjuring 2. The Conjuring 2 was released in 2016 and followed Ed and Lorraine as they travelled to Enfield in the United Kingdom to assist the Hodgson family, who was said to be experiencing paranormal activity inside of their home in 1977, with the daughter Janet even becoming possessed by a former resident. Now, this movie is very much based on a true story. However, when a paranormal experience is dubbed real, people tend to try and find holes in the story, with many doubting the accounts of the family. Like I said, the Enfield poltergeist was a claim of supernatural activity between the years of 1977 to 1979, with it specifically involving 2 sisters, Margaret and Janet. In August of 1977, single-parent Peggy Hodgson claimed she had witnessed furniture moving and heard knocking sounds around her home. A police officer arrived on scene and he himself reported seeing a chair wobble and slide across the floor without any rhyme or reason. Following this, disembodied voices were heard, loud noises echoed around the home, and the children even began levitating. More than 30 people were reported seeing furniture move and heard voices around the home. Ed and Lorraine Warren were of course called in to assess the situation, with them visiting the home in 1978 and were convinced that the events had a supernatural explanation. We have the White Lady of Easton. Located in Easton, Connecticut, Union Cemetery is a site that dates back to the 1700s, and according to ghost hunters and paranormal investigators, it is one of the most haunted cemeteries in all of the United States. Now, according to local legend, a ghost haunts Union Cemetery who has been dubbed the White Lady. She's also said to haunt Stepney Cemetery in Monroe as well. She is described as wearing a white nightgown or a wedding dress-esque outfit, with demonologist Ed Warren once claiming to have physical evidence to support these claims. Now, claims of paranormal occurrences at the cemetery had been occurring for decades prior to Ed and Lorraine Warren investigating the location. Ed Warren and several Eastern police officers visited the site, which is when Ed supposedly caught the apparition on camera. Ed claimed that several ghost lights came together to form the shape of a woman who had no facial features, but had dark hair and was wearing a white dress. Terrifying. Now, there isn't a whole lot of information about the ghost or the cemetery, however, Ed and Lorraine Warren wrote a book about the location entitled Graveyard. Maybe check it out. You do you. Before we jump into number 4, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, it really helps out a lot. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Satan's Harvest. Now, many will be familiar with the name Maurice Theriault, or more commonly referred to as Frenchie, thanks to the movie The Nun, with the character appearing throughout. However, I should preface this point by saying that everything that happened in The Nun with Frenchie is in fact fictional, but the character is very much based on a real person. Frenchie was the son of French-Canadian farmers in Maine and grew up in a fairly toxic and abusive household, with his father exhibiting violent tendencies towards him. At the age of 51, Frenchie was living in Massachusetts with his wife Nancy and their children. To friends, he was a gentle man and extremely kind to anyone he met. However, behind closed doors housed something truly evil. He explained that his behavior was the result of being possessed by a demon, which pushed him towards violence. Blood would flow from his eyes and religious markings began to appear on his body. A local parish priest called in the help of Ed and Lorraine Warren because, of course, apparently everyone knows Ed and Lorraine. During their investigation, they saw Frenchie bleed from his eyes and saw symbols appear on his body. He also exhibited superhuman strength, which they believe was the result of demonic possession. They specifically believed that Frenchie had fallen into the grip of Satan himself. 3 exorcisms were performed on Frenchie, the latter of which proved to be something truly terrifying. Frenchie's face began to change, his skin burned and blistered, and on his forehead a deep wound appeared, and his eyes began to look like snake eyes. However, the exorcism ultimately proved to be a success, with him having no incidents following.
Perron House. This maybe is the most famous of all the Warrens' cases, and definitely one of the most recognizable, as it was the case that inspired the first of the Conjuring smash hit films, and I'll be honest, it's probably why you even know who the Warrens are. I'm certain if you're watching this video or you've been a longtime fan of the channel, you know the ins and the outs of the Perron family haunting probably better than I do, to be honest. But hey, we could all use a little refresher and a little touch-up sometimes. There's nothing wrong with review, so let's get right into it. In 1971, the Perron family moved their 5 daughters into a massive farmhouse in Rhode Island. I think the thing had like 14 bedrooms or something just absurd. It seemed perfect for Carolyn and Roger Perron. They had found their dream home. It was spacious, it was a nice neighborhood, there was room for their kids to play. It would have been a perfect forever home if it wasn't for the fact that malicious spirits had already decided to make it theirs. Shortly after the Perrons moved in, they noticed a series of inexplicable happenings. At first it was pretty benign, you know, some things go missing, objects move unexpectedly, you find a chair in a room you wouldn't expect it to, but then it ramped up rather quickly. The Perrons would claim every morning they would smell the smell of rotten flesh, and they would wake up to discover their beds levitating, and you know what, on some mornings I'd probably sleep right through that too. The family researched the house a little and discovered that it had been owned by a lineage of one family for 8 generations, with many members of the family dying under some pretty mysterious circumstances. They also learned that a woman named Bathsheba had lived there, a possible Satanist and witch, and they believed that she was haunting the home, threatened by Carolyn Perron's energy, seeing her as a threat to her. This is when the Warrens were called in to do a seance, to try and commune with the spirits beyond. One of the Perrons' daughters claims that they saw their mother speak in tongues, possessed by the spirits. Now, in the film, they went a bit Hollywood with it. The Warrens perform an exorcism and Ed Warren saves the day. But the real story wasn't so neatly wrapped up. The Warrens were actually kicked out of this house by Roger Perron, who said that they were just making things worse and they were making his wife's mental health worsen. The Perrons would end up remaining living in that home for the better part of a decade. And you know what? Honestly, if rent was good enough, and if I could get those malevolent spirits to offer to, I don't know, help out with the dishes every now and again, maybe kick in a few bucks for Hydra and the internet, I'd probably be okay with it too.
The Donovan House Ouija debacle. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Leave Ouija boards alone. But yeah, here goes. Let me set the scene for y'all. 15-year-old Patty Donovan came across the Ouija board and decided to use it to find a friend. And from the first yes in response to her queries, Patty was hooked. She spent months falling in love with a spirit she believed to be in love with her, telling it private details about her everyday life. After a year of telling all of her secrets to the board, on the evening of March 2nd, Patty now pleaded for the spirit to manifest. And the next morning, Patty and her dad both found their cars damaged in such a way that wasn't humanly possible. Later that week, other incidents of apparent vandalism occurred around the house, such as, foundation shrubs being yanked to the ground, roots and all. On the roof, a 6-foot cast iron pipe housing electrical wires was found bent at a 90-degree angle. That doesn't happen. On Friday, March 8th, Patty's dad marked one flat on the kitchen calendar, and no sooner did Patty get her car back from the shop than one of her other tires lost air. The next day, Saturday, her father made the same entry on the calendar, although this time it seems like the tire had been, slashed. In the meantime, Patty could no longer raise her invisible boyfriend on the board, having no idea that her ethereal beau actually manifested in the form of a supernatural vandal. By the second week of March, material damage to the house and cars had become so troublesome that her dad complained to the police. Now when they arrived, he pointed out the destruction, and the police assured Ted, they'd keep an eye on the property during night patrols. Later that second week, after work one night, Ted and his wife Ellen were sitting in the kitchen with their son Brian when all three heard something smash against a wall somewhere inside the house. Cautiously moving to investigate, they found a gaping 18-inch hole in the plasterboard wall in Brian's room. But it wasn't just like a regular, hole. Instead, the jagged edges of the plasterboard were pointing inward, with the blow coming from inside the walls. Listening in the dark that night, Ted heard the sound of a board being pried loose. But after checking the entire house thoroughly, found no loose boards. The house was further plagued by loud noises every night that only escalated in frequency and volume, along with further unexplainable damage to the walls. On April 1st, furniture began to levitate in the worst April Fool's Day joke of all time, with a 250-pound dresser flinging its contents while flying erratically. Rocks had also begun to rain from the sky, pelting only the Donovan house, which the police bore witness to. Ted eventually broke down at work and explained the horror of his home to his supervisor, who urged him to reach out to the Warrens. Ted instead tried moving his family into a hotel first, and the spirits followed the family there, destroying the room and making so much noise that the family was thrown out of the hotel and forced to return home. Finally contacting Ed and Lorraine, they arrived in Maine as quickly as they were able to, finding the home in complete disarray. Lorraine originally said nothing, although at the time, she sensed in the home the presence of entities so numerous and threatening that she had to fight with herself to keep from running outside. After a lengthy tour of the house, Ed and Lorraine conducted an interview with the entire family, where Patty's history with the Ouija board was finally revealed. The Warrens then contacted the Catholic Church to begin the process for an exorcism to be granted, which sadly took about a month. After the exorcism took place on May 2nd, the family was finally free of the demonic torment, but left with over $5,000 in damages, which would be over like 30 grand in today's money. Honestly, it's already such a perfect horror movie story. I'd pay to watch that in theaters. Number 4, an object open to interpretation. So what appears to the innocent eye as nothing but a long black spike, perhaps left over from like a construction project of sorts, holds quite the history of sadness and evil doing. Being the oldest item listed today, its history dates back to its use in the 1700s. Now while the name of the witch it belonged to has been lost to time, the spike was originally used in a black mass ritual in an attempt to summon Satan himself to this world. The witch we're speaking of had attempted to curse the stake over the course of her pregnancy, hoping that it would become strong enough to take the soul of her womb in exchange for the devil. During the ritual, she plunged the stake into the flesh as sacrifice, but while it strengthened her relationship with Satan, it didn't succeed in bringing him to earth. The stake was passed down as a family heirloom, bringing a feeling of longing and sadness to any that held it, until it was finally acquired by the Warrens. While the details of this particular artifact may be a little less detailed than other tales on our list today, I truly think there's a story there that could be adapted very well into the current Conjuring universe. But let me know in the comments what you think. Number 2, the Conjuring mirror. Originally belonging to a 45-year-old New Jersey man named Oliver Birnbaum, it was used to practice a medieval ritual known as speculum, or mirror magic. He performed a lengthy incantation ritual known as a conjuring formula, inviting the spirit world to assist him in manipulating the future. In the beginning, Oliver saw very little in the mirror other than the movement of blurred forms or quick little incidents that meant nothing to him. But the more he concentrated his attention into the mirror, the more control Oliver gained, and ergo, the more he could see. After performing this ritual obsessively for months, he got to the point where all he had to do was state what he wanted to see, and the desired image would appear, eventually being able to tune into the future whenever whenever he so pleased. He gained the ability to project people he didn't like into the mirror, singling them out for punishment or revenge. The unknowing victim would be shown in a future situation, and Oliver would will misfortune to that person, being able to see his justice occur in the mirror just the way he planned it. And while this sounds like a fun projection of one's imagination, these malicious acts would actually be carried out by inhuman spirits. In order to make a victim fall down the stairs, a spirit would either momentarily disorient the person, pour some grease on a step, or go so far as to give the victim a psychokinetic push. Eventually, Oliver neglected the part of the ritual where he had to give homage to Satan, and as a result, the evil he proposed for others began to occur to him, along with the spirits that he turned loose on his enemies, now, infesting his own home instead. After about a week of torment, this man was so terrified that he called a prominent Catholic official and begged him to send a demonologist to his house. When the Warrens arrived at the address, they met a man frightened out of his wits, and rightfully so. Doors were opening and closing by themselves. Every minute, something would crash or break or bounce off a wall and smash. Ed was able to reverse the ritual originally enacted by Oliver and bless the house, stopping the disturbance. As the Warrens were about to depart, Oliver insisted they take the mirror with them, and the 5-foot-tall antique now lives in the museum. I can already picture the visuals that could come out of a movie based on this case. Can't you? Number 1, the black lace veil. Now, while I obviously love the idea of like a cute gothy aesthetic, this is anything but. After one of their public lectures, Ed was conversing with a couple that had been in the audience, where the boy introduced himself as Alan and explained that he'd brought his girlfriend Lonnie to the lecture because he suspected that she'd been overtaken by some occult influence. He explained that when his girlfriend became angry, her features would change into something resembling a wolf, and then the voice of a different person would speak from inside of her. When Lorraine walked over to join the group, Lonnie experienced an episode of instantaneous possession and lurched out in an attempt to attack Lorraine. Now, this incident terrified everyone in the vicinity, with the Warrens ending the audience chat session immediately before Ed escorted the couple to an offstage room while Lorraine stayed outside. In the backstage room, the girl was fully under possession, breathing heavily, and her facial features had transformed into the wolf-like appearance the boy had talked about. After about 10 minutes, the possession passed, and Lonnie was lucid enough to explain dealing with memory loss along with losing hours and days of her life over the last 3 months, which is a symptom common in possession. She went on to share her background. She was a girl wealthy enough to buy whatever she wanted, but money can't always buy love. Originally, her now boyfriend Alan had refused all of her advances and bribery attempts at becoming hers, and she resorted to visiting a store prominent in selling tools to help with witchcraft, purchasing there a book on the black arts, and later that night performing a ritual for acquiring lovers. This ritual involved, you guessed it, the black lace veil, on top of which she placed a crown of goat horns before renouncing God and her baptism, along with swearing allegiance to Satan, finalizing the ritual by washing down the vow with a cup of animal life force. You know, simple stuff you can just get at the grocery store. About a month after Lonnie performed the ritual, Alan began paying her the attention she craved, making her entitled world perfect. What she hadn't counted on, however, was that she was in debt to the demonic, having given them permission to enter her life. Ed knew immediately that Lonnie would have to undergo an exorcism as soon as possible, and made contact with the priest the next morning, who was able to come assist with the procedure. Upon arrival, the priest insisted on testing the spirit, just to make sure everything was, as he was told. He instructed Lonnie to close her eyes and slowly count to 20, while his assistant stood behind her and placed a cross 6 inches behind her head. The entity possessing the girl suddenly went wild, screaming, "Take it away, it burns, take it away." During the exorcism, it kept screaming, she's mine, her soul is mine," in reference to, well, Lonnie. It was eventually separated from Lonnie, but just before it departed, the thing vowed it would return to another. The Warrens brought the black lace veil, goat horns, cup, and the Conjuring book home with them, so she would be safe from repossession, but the tale of the veil doesn't end here. Ed received a phone call one day from a man named John Rand, who wanted him to meet his daughter Charlene, who he explained possessed a natural knowledge of what he took to be witchcraft. When she stared at people, even when they weren't aware of it, she'd fill their mind with inhuman terror. Honestly, that could be a nifty little trick. John called Ed specifically because Charlene was manifesting different personalities, some male, some female, and some that couldn't even be called human, but all making extremely threatening statements to John and his wife. Upon bringing Charlene to various doctors and clergymen, they recommended John be put in contact with Ed, and Ed agreed to have the girl and her father visit his home the next weekend. When Ed attempted to shake Charlene's hand upon meeting her, she backed away and stared distrustfully at him, keeping track of every move he made. His attempts to question her resulted in no-end answers, and her eyes began to wander about the room in boredom. When they landed on the black lace veil, though, Charlene jumped up, grabbed the veil, and clutched it to her chest. Her features immediately began to transform into those of a wild, sneering creature, distinct from this otherwise, Lovely girl. Ed drew 2 vials of water to himself, one unblessed, the other blessed by an exorcist, and moved away from what was no longer Charlene, but an inhuman spirit. A lesser devil of hell, if you will. Horrid moaning and various animal sounds came from the girl as Ed blessed her, banishing the demon away for now a second time. Thankfully, these items have been locked away in the museum ever since. Forget a standalone movie, I feel like this object could spawn an entire franchise. Seriously.